One of the most enduring mysteries in English history relates to the disappearance of two young brothers inside of the Tower of London. These boys were more than just brothers. They were the King of England, Edward V, and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York. The boys, aged 12 and 9, were inside the Tower of London, as was tradition, awaiting the coronation of Edward V, following the death of their father, Edward IV. The boys were lodged in the tower and were under the care of their uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. But over time the boys would disappear from the eyes of witnesses, and they were then declared illegitimate, and their uncle usurped the throne, becoming King Richard III. What happened to the two boys has remained elusive for over 500 years, and there are many theories and beliefs as to what happened. However, there were also two sets of remains belonging to children discovered in the tower. Join us today as we look at English history's biggest mystery, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The story of the princes in the tower begins with the death of King Edward IV on the 9th of April 1483. He was a king who was seen as a victor during the Wars of the Roses, as he twice deposed King Henry VI, and he was a champion of the House of York's claims to the throne. But following Edward IV's death, his son Edward, the new King Edward V, was inside of Ludlow Castle towards the Welsh marches, and his uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, was appointed the protector of the boy king. Richard was inside Middleham Castle in Yorkshire, and he then went to York Minster to pledge his allegiance to the new king, his nephew. Edward V then travelled to London from the west, his uncle also travelling from the north, and they met at Stony Stratford. But Richard the Duke of Gloucester then arrested the chaperones of his nephew. They were then sent to Pontefract Castle, where they were then executed by axe. Richard took possession of his nephew the king, himself, and Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the new king and former queen, then took herself, along with her other son, Richard the Duke of York, into sanctuary along with her daughters for safety in Westminster Abbey. The pair arrived in London together, and there were plans drawn up for the coronation of King Edward V, but this was postponed to the 25th of June 1483. By the law of the land he was now ruling, as following his father's death he would have become automatically the king. Edward V on the 19th of May 1483 was inside the Tower of London to await his coronation as was tradition, and he was on the 16th of June joined by his younger brother Richard the Duke of York, who left his mother's care and the sanctuary. But then on the 22nd of June 1483, a sermon was preached at St. Paul's Cross that stated that the only legitimate heir to the throne was in fact Richard the Duke of Gloucester, and a group of lords and knights then went to the protector and uncle of the king to plead with him to take the throne for himself. Richard accepted, and he seized the crown, becoming King Richard III, and was crowned on the 6th of July, and with this both his nephews, Edward V and Richard the Duke of York, or of Shrewsbury, were declared illegitimate. This was because it was said that Edward IV had a pre-contract of marriage with another woman, when he then later married Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the children. The boys remained inside of the Tower of London, and much of the evidence and testimony we have about the antics and activities of the boys inside the tower comes from an Italian friar named Dominique Mancini. He visited England in the spring and summer of 1483 and wrote about what he had heard regarding the king. He wrote how Richard III had seized the throne, and that Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were then taken into the inner apartments of the Tower of London, and over time they were seen less and less. Eventually he said that the boys vanished, and that Edward at the time may have been very sick, as he was visited by a doctor. Mancini recorded that he was like a victim being prepared for sacrifice, and sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. But the reports of the two princes playing in the tower disappeared after summer 1483, and there was allegedly an attempt to rescue them from the Tower of London in July, but then from this they seemingly disappeared. What is interesting is that people at the time believed that the boys were in harm's way. There have been many theories put forward that the boys may have been exiled and sent away from the tower, being forced to live in quiet. There would be later pretenders who emerged claiming to be the boys, and some even believe this may have been them. But the issue with the princes in the tower is that there was actually very little evidence that exists saying absolutely anything. There is no evidence that states the boys were murdered, or that they disappeared, and that they simply vanished from the history books. There are a number of accounts written of the time that are currently under investigation, and many of these are found inside of archives in European countries. For example, the account of Mancini was found in Lille in France. There were many rumours of the prince's death across the continent and inside of France, and these were also banded around the royal court. They heard that Richard III had killed the princes before he then seized the throne for himself. But much of what we know about the princes in the tower comes from the account of Sir Thomas More, a Tudor writer and historian, who would later go on to serve inside of Henry VIII's government. More was a historian, and he wrote The History of King Richard III, and in this he writes that the murder of the boys was in fact Sir James Tyrrell, a man who served Richard III for some time, and he was said to have confessed to his actions before he was then executed for treason. More then claimed that the princes were smothered to death, that they were buried at the foot of some stairs deep in the ground under a heap of stones, and he also said they were then moved to a different burial place. Henry VII's own historian even claimed that Tyrrell was the murderer, and that he committed the murder with reluctance upon the king's orders. Further writers, including Shakespeare, point the finger at King Richard III, but as mentioned, the evidence towards this theory is debatable. But there were two bodies found remarkably inside the Tower of London. On the 17th of July 1674, there were a group of workmen who were completing building work, specifically inside the White Tower. They then found two small human skeletons, which had been buried 10 feet under a staircase that led to the chapel of the White Tower. These would have been in the very location matched by what Sir Thomas More stated, but he then claimed that the bodies of the boys were moved to a different location. There had even been another set of children's skeletons found previously inside the White Tower, in what was an old chamber which had been walled up, but these could have also been the princes. The bodies found under the stairs were specifically of interest due to them being exactly where Sir Thomas More stated, and a report claimed that they were found with pieces of rag and velvet around them, with velvet being material linked to the aristocracy and of someone important. 4 years after the bones were found, the King Charles II had the remains placed inside of an urn, which was then placed inside of Westminster Abbey. They were placed in the walls of the Henry VII Lady Chapel, and it was said that these categorically were the remains of the two princes. A monument designed by Christopher Wren marks the site of their interment, and the inscription on this says, "Here lie interred the remains of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, whose long desired and much sought after bones, after over 190 years, were found interred deep beneath the rubble of the stairs that led to the chapel of the White Tower on the 17th of July in the year of our Lord, 1674. The bones of these boys were examined in 1933 by leading anatomists and professors, and they stated that the bones did belong to children around the same age of the two boys. They also found rusty nails and other animal bones, but they also came across the fact that one of the skeletons was larger than the other, but a number of bones had gone missing, and the remains were not complete. These bones have never been subjected to further examination, and the investigation that took place missed many key details, including whether the bones were of males or females, and there are still so many questions regarding this. But there was also, interestingly, another theory regarding the bones of other children found near to the royal burial vault inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor. In 1789, workmen were doing some work inside of St George's Chapel within the walls of Windsor Castle, and they broke into the burial vault of Edward IV and his queen, Elizabeth Woodville. They also found a small adjoining vault, and inside this vault was found the coffins of two unidentified children. No further inspection was carried out, and the vault was then resealed. It was claimed that these coffins carried the names of two of Edward's children, George and Mary, but two other lead coffins, marked as George and Mary Plantagenets, had been found elsewhere. This meant there were 2 more coffins belonging to children of Edward IV in this vault, and that these must have been children of the king, as they would have been related to the Yorkist king and buried next to their father. But in the 1990s, work was being carried out again near to Edward IV's tomb, and a request was then put forward to examine the 2 vaults using modern-day technology, and there were calls to examine the 2 lead coffins, but royal consent was not granted to open the royal vaults and the tombs for this. There have been many other beliefs put forward as to what happened to the boys, but the most common perception is that King Richard III may have had something to do with it, or that he ordered someone like Sir James Tyrrell to murder the boys. One thing to consider is that the Tower of London was a royal residence, meaning anyone off the street could not simply enter the gates and walk through. This meant that if someone had killed the boys on the orders of Richard III, then they would have been allowed through the gates to do this and past the guards, or someone of significant rank and nobility who would not have raised suspicion amongst the guards was let in to do it. It was Richard III's job to keep an eye on the boys, meaning that someone needed his permission to have access to the princes. Another theory is that the man who killed the boys was Henry Stafford, the 2nd Duke of Buckingham. He was Richard's right-hand man and was later executed himself. It was stated in one document that Buckingham was the guilty party, and it was said, after the passing of King Edward in the year of 83, another one of his brothers, the Duke of Gloucester, had in his power the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York, the young sons of the said king and his brother, and turned them to the Duke of Buckingham, under whose custody the said princes were starved to death. One thing to also consider is this was not the first time that something dark and devious had been carried out inside the Tower of London, at this time at the hands of the House of York. King Henry VI, the deposed Lancastrian king of the Wars of the Roses, died within the walls of the Tower of London, as he was allegedly murdered on the orders of King Edward IV. He was allegedly stabbed inside of the chapel whilst he was praying inside of his rooms. This would mean that the tower was becoming a place of murder and scheming, and some even allege that Richard III was involved in this murder. One man who is also tenuously linked to the disappearance is Henry VII, who following his defeat of Richard III and the seizure of the crown, had some of his rivals to the throne executed. Some historians have suggested that Henry VII may have done away with the princes, also to legitimise his claim to the throne, and one way he also did this was to marry their eldest sister, Elizabeth of York, ending the Wars of the Roses and uniting the 2 houses, but there is little evidence regarding the involvement of Henry VII. Today there is still an ongoing investigation into the princes in the tower, and further evidence is emerging about the boys, including a piece that even alluded to the fact that Edward V may have lived out the rest of his days inside of a village in Devon under a false name. But today the mystery still captivates the world, and debate still occurs as to what happened to them. In the years after, the Tower of London became a place which was synonymous with execution and torture, and the suffering of the princes may have been what helped to make the Tower of London one of the most brutal and horrific prisons in England and in history. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.